Thanks, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I believe this talk initially started out as a presentation by Rachel, but last week when Rachel was giving another presentation, I piped up and asked a few questions about the actual sense-making process, since the Society Library is also a sense-making and collective intelligence institute. So it led to an evolution of what the talk was going to be, and we're going to talk about, like, in a very meta way, how do we go about making sense of things? How does the Consilience project make sense of things? How do they detect bias in their own sense making? And then I'm happy to also be here on behalf of the Society Library to talk about how we structure our sense making process and procedure, and also how we deal with bias in the sense making process. Because perhaps when the stakes are incredibly high when it comes to making sense of things, if we are making technical errors because of the flaws in human judgment, that could be more consequential. So it's probably really important that we be slow and careful and considerate in how we go about drawing conclusions from propositions. So with that being said, I'll start by introducing myself. Hi, my name is Jamie, and I am the Executive Director of the Society Library. Society Library is a collective intelligence institute, and what we're focused on is improving the relationship between information and humanity. And so we look at this in three different ways. One, how do we interact with information in an educational sense? So one of our programs, the Society Library itself, is about how do we collect, organize, and steward the relationship between various forms of information and individuals. The Society Library itself participates in conversation about, like, data provenance on the internet, as well as what is the future of textual expression actually going to be. The other project we have relates to how do we use information in order to make decisions. So we work on a variety of different decision-making models and governance models. And then the third is how do we use information as a medium of communication between individuals so individuals can express needs. And that is done through our Great American Debate Project, because currently that's limited by US English-speaking only text. And some of the most critical projects we work with include a topic of climate change and also COVID-19. So to explain what it is precisely that we do, the Society Library extracts arguments, claims, and evidence from various forms of media in order to construct databases which articulate the logical reasoning of all points of view on complex social and political issues. So for example, with the topic of COVID-19, we found there was about 569 different subtopics of debate that Americans were engaging in when it came to COVID-19. There's some fundamental questions that orient the logical reasoning of how we talk about these things, and I can talk about that specific process a little bit later. But essentially, our social problems are incredibly complex. The amount of information that's being deployed in reasoning about it exceeds the ability for, in my opinion, the individual human mind to be able to comprehend, especially when there's like 300 different types of cognitive biases or logical fallacies and 190 different cognitive biases that can wreck our way of making sense of things. So the Society Library is really focused on how can we externalize not only our knowledge base, but externalize the logical processing of this content so we can make more inclusive, informed, and unbiased decisions. And I think that's good for an intro to start. So thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to talk about bias and sense making. And Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I second that motion that it's difficult to engage in collective cooperative sense-making or decision-making whilst dealing with unknowns, particularly when many of the issues are unknowable. So, you know, we are interested in the rational, rule-based algorithmic process as well, particularly related to media in a segment Meta News, is finding a way to develop greater wisdom with, you know, for society as a whole, and you know, in the absence of ideology. And so, of course, we want to make good choices. We want to make informed choices, and this is done on the basis of, you know, good faith, earnest dialogue. But these questions, and you know, many of these topics are very subjective. So, you know, it's philosophers and psychologists have been, you know, debating from time immemorial about what is truth, and we're trying to distill this down to simple second language that this can be introduced into a sort of simple vernacular so that those who are involved in the discourse can actually comprehend complex abstractions. So part of what the Consilience group is doing, the first segment is educational. We're collecting a body of work that gives examples and tries to explain almost an encyclopedia for different types of cognitive biases, fallacies, techniques that are used to that help create these different ideological blind spots, and things like motivated reasoning or bad faith arguments. And then we give examples with situational assessments, which take emerging sort of non-popular or not highly popularized issues and bring them into the forefront, where we exemplify, how these different tools are used. Again, things like Lakoff framing or Russell conjugation. And then the third part is we do an analysis across different forms of media, really trying to steelman all the different alternative arguments. Some of it on the basis of, some of it is quantitative, and some of it is based on reasoning. And we're in the process of developing all of this, so we're a relatively nascent organization. Our ultimate objective is to cooperate and collaborate with various organizations like your own, and develop, I think Daniel states it as a digital Bretton Woods, a modern way of navigating the complexities of, the tyranny of exponential tech, while we're trying, while still having human brains that haven't evolved for the last 10,000 years. But this is a collaborative process. We're in the learning stages right now. We're still compiling our bedrock of, primary work. And so we're really looking forward to collaboration and new ideas, and certainly people steel manning what we're doing as well to help us improve our process.
Well, I just want to say, Rachel, also, hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. So I want to say, thank you, Rachel, for being here. It's great to talk to you, but also how rude of me. I haven't said hi to everyone else. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I know we chatted a little bit before we started. Rachel, I'm so excited to hear that this Consilience project is interested in educational projects, because we are as well. I don't know if I've talked to your group about this actually, but we have this whole Bill Nye of reasoning and rationality project that we're putting together. And I don't think I should name drop who we're working with, because I don't think it's really official yet. But we've had a soft yes. And it's essentially,
Sorry to interrupt. I was just asking, is it Bill Nye?
It is not Bill Nye. No, it is not. So we will have to change the name. We don't want to infringe upon any copyright here. No, it's not Bill Nye, but it's someone who is like the Bill Nye of reasoning, in my very humble opinion. But it's all about, how can we teach future generations about how, your mind is a tool that you can use to make sense of the world, but how are all the ways in which it's flawed and doing you a disservice? And what are different tips and tricks that, kids can learn? And that's what we're really looking to do too, is, beyond just the so many cognitive biases and logical fallacies that I've mentioned, there's also things like neuro-linguistic programming, and then, framing of information and biasing language itself. So there's so many things that we can teach upcoming generations to be wary of. And this all goes back to at least the Society Library premise that humanity's relationship to information is just one of the most fundamental and important. And if we can really master that, I believe that a lot of the ideas that the people in this existential hope group are thinking about could come to light if we really master that relationship. Great. So I think just to be clear with everyone in the room, so the Consilience Project is a new organization. And right now you're creating a series of news articles, meta news, I believe is what they're called, situational analyses. And can you talk a little bit more about the actual products, just so we can start differentiating between our approaches?
Sure. I mentioned them briefly, but maybe they all sort of meld together. Our three main products that we have, the first one are our series of theory pieces, which essentially work on the basis, explain through this sort of simplistic language, or not simplistic, but non-jargonized, explicit language, giving, clear examples of particular types of tools that are used to both sometimes improve information, sometimes to weaponize information. And all of these tools are, in order to clarify whether or not they're so the theory pieces are all supposed to build off of each other. They're independent independent works that sort of function as the metaphor we have for it is bricks in a pyramid. So kind of be read individually. You can also come in at any particular point in time. It's informative, but it's not definitional. It's supposed to be exemplary. And so those are the fundamental theory pieces to help understand how how our decisions are sometimes veiled by various types of tools, the implicit tool, the implicit fallacies, but also the cognitive biases, but also the disinformation, or sort of when these things are weaponized against an individual. The second piece that we have is the series of situational assessments, which take current events, and we discuss a new topic. We have a piece that we just published about digital technology in Taiwan. And, within that, we give examples of how these different tools are used in those examples. So, motivated reasoning and, Russell conjugation, Lakoff framing, and all of these things that are the fundamentals of the theory pieces. And then the meta news is where we take a particular polarized issue and we analyze all the different ways in which the media has represented it accurately and in goods of distortion. And that's more in ways of trying to winnow out the story and how much of it has, so as you've said, Amy, you've done some research on fact checking, and facts are insufficient because they are true, maybe, but not representative. So in order to fully understand a situation, you have to understand the context and, the greater definitional, the whole 360 landscape of what it means. And so the meta news attempts to assess the different ways in which the media have portrayed particular stories. So it's not really an analysis of the story, but an analysis of how the media has covered the story, both from the right and the left and the center.
Okay, that's great. I haven't seen one of those pieces in particular. So how is it that you're representing how the different media organizations are like making sense of a particular issue? And like, are you pointing out down to like at the level of proposition, like they've used this biased word in which there is no evidence to suggest that this particular adjective is accurate in association with this event? Like down to what level are you identifying this type of biased language or rhetoric or however you identify it?
It's not so much an analysis of the language. It's really a way to we're using various media tools like Media Cloud, for example, to investigate various references and to find primary origins and sources of particular statements that are made, and then a sort of weighted analysis of what exactly took place. We've tested one. We've had one meta news that we've actually worked on at this moment. So we're still in the process of developing it. It needs to improve. It probably will be improved over time. I know that you have a media tool that's very similar. So I think that there could be some good symbiosis there. We looked at the pallet of bricks story during the Black Lives Matters, and a particular premise as to whether or not the bricks had been placed there, or they were randomly there was random chaos that had developed naturally. And so
All right. Thank you.
so a lot of it was looking at the ways the media actually accounted for it, because the media had a lot of influence in terms of what people were perceiving, and much of the information were rebroadcasts or retweets from other sources, which actually had no real primary source. So stories began to propagate where there was no origin for it. And really was a question of just determine where stories originated from and how well sourced they were, and how much sort of fact-checking the fact-checking, references. We had a whole team. I was in years using these various tools to look at references through language, and then we had a couple of people actually doing the analysis themselves.
Got it. Okay. Sorry, you broke up a little bit, and I'm hoping, because you and I have had fantastic conversations before, so I'm hoping we really get in the groove and like can dive in deep on some of these things. So you mentioned like perception, like the media is responsible for, and I feel like this has kind of devolved into like a question answer format, which is not what I'm hoping for. So I hope we catch a wave soon. So when it comes to the media creating perception, this is something that the Society Library is really, really interested in engaging with. So, our sense-making process, the Society Library is not a small team of individuals who are trying to sense make and produce some sort of media output, like the narrative, making sense of all of the disparate narratives. The Society Library is working on creating essentially sense-making machines. How can we mass process all of this information, but down to the datum, and like not necessarily synthesize it to make sense of it for people, but provide that information so that we can increase like the complexity literacy of the public, and we can create media products from there. But the Society Library is really dedicated to not making sense of anything for anyone until we've done the duty of literally logically steel manning down to the datum every single point of view on an issue. And so our process and procedure of how we go about sense making, I think, is extremely rigorous. It's this whole pipeline. And at the end of that pipeline, and we have all these anti-bias measures all the way through, but at the end of that pipeline, we're asking ourselves the question about how are we presenting this information so as not to bias as much as possible, because it's impossible to account for how someone's going to interact with information. It's not only just the knowledge that they're bringing to the conversation or like their history or their demographic, but also did they have breakfast that morning when they're interacting with the information that like essentially it's a chemical reaction of it. So there's only so much we can control, but to the amount that we can control, how can we start tinkering with the presentation of information beyond even text, even evolving meaning from being represented by text alone or a reference by video alone into something that is more comprehensive and that induces a certain kind of comprehension. So this is something that we're thinking about a lot at the Society Library. We recently wrote a piece, it's called Web-Based Conceptual Portmanteau. And essentially, when you think of portmanteau as like this physical combining of words to have a more nuanced, specific word created, I mean, that's very like flat. That's a flat, like a connection between two things. But with technology, we can combine things conceptually. So how can we combine multiple iterations of a specific claim into one node package? How do we embed definitions, which we already do, hyperlinks, which we already do? How can we have this claim express its meaning through all of these different videos that we've sourced from different areas? And every time this particular claim has occurred in a podcast, how do we knit all of that together into one node package? Is that potentially the future of text? And this is all in service of how can we induce comprehension? How can we be incredibly precise in the meaning of this claim here, as opposed to this is the one sentence that we choose in order to articulate a particular idea. And if you happen to get it because you have the right context or frame of reference or whatever, that's great. But it could also increase the surface area of misunderstanding if we're not incredibly precise. So we're thinking about that end visualization of information because we care so deeply about not manipulating perception, but instead enabling comprehension. So
I like what you said about mood influencing, perception too. That goes back to Kahneman and Tversky's classic work that they did in 1976 about, Supreme Court judges and, whether or not first in Israel, and I think they did studies elsewhere afterwards, and maybe in the United States, but cases, reflecting whether or not the judges had eaten breakfast that day or the time of meal that they were, actually making their decisions, how close it was to mealtime, not based on their background, their ideology, or any of the other things that we typically look for when we think people are making decisions. And it gets back to this question of how do we actually not just approximate a closer objective reality, but understand that most of our perspectives come from a place of judgment. So how do we actually develop good judgment? And I think this is where I think there could be a great confluence between what the Society Library is doing and what the Consilience Project is doing, which is, so much of your work is focused on this, rule-based logic, which I think is great. But at the same time, most of the decisions that are made, or at least, what's been empirically demonstrated through, many psychological, studies have shown that decisions are actually totally irrational, and they're not necessarily based on, any kind of formal logic. And so most of the important decisions that are being made for society are based on these judgment-based, subjective judgment-based cases. And so what's interesting is I've been reading Kahneman's new work and a bunch of other case studies on, noise. Noise has been, overshadowed by bias, and a big issue that I think society has, in terms of making decisions, is that humans are really unreliable in their decision making, not just in their perspective, but that their decision making is highly variable, even within the same person. So, there's that reference of, think on it a little bit later, because, in a week or two, you may feel differently, even though external circumstances may not have changed. So it's not just that there's variability in decision making between people, but within ourselves. And so there's interesting new work that's looking at not just the wisdom of the crowds, but also the crowd within, and looking various studies that look at variability between individuals themselves and how their decision making can actually improve, silencing noise on the basis of how we actually query ourselves on particular issues. There's a group of two Germans who are actually looking at ways in which they steelman themselves. They generate a particular question, they give themselves a pause. There's another group that looked at querying themselves, but pausing for a number of weeks before answering the question again. And then the second group of Germans were looking at, they call it dialectical bootstrapping, where they then frame the same question, but try to generate an answer as far away from the original answer as possible, in order to sort of look at the variability between these two distinct answers. And I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting because it gets back. So the point, I think what the Consilience Project is focusing on is how to generate better wisdom. And, wisdom is based on not just perception and, multi-perspectivism, but it's also, of course, you need earnestness and clarity. But and to be well informed, but also to understand that we ourselves are constantly transforming our opinions and moods on a regular basis. So how do we actually quiet that bias within ourselves, or come up with a more consistent way of understanding ourselves? I mean, I think so. I like what you guys are doing, because, and I think it's important to have some kind of systematic way of analyzing something through a algorithmic process. But I also think it's important to look at the way in which most people make decisions, which is through this gestalt, like and we call it common sense, but we still don't know how to define it. So I like this idea of trying to really come up with a universal way in good faith of generating better common sense for people, so that we don't actually have to rely on a tool to tell us what to do. I think GPS is an amazing tool and technology, and if I get really lost, I'd like to follow it. But I also would like to know within myself that I can sort of trust my own biology to help me navigate, in 4 dimensions. And so I think that is part of the Consilience goal, which is to improve choice making on the basis of, better informing people, but also helping people develop a greater sense of understanding of the epistemic process of trying to understand of complex problems.
I don't disagree with any of that at all. And I see a bunch of hands up. So let's get to these hands raised. But one thing I want to say is, in us not disagreeing, the Society Library believes that having this externalized procedure for to ensure that the process of our sense making isn't corrupted by whether one of our analysts happened to have breakfast that day. We have a very strong culture. We've got all these virtues and values. We have all of these documents to help induce a sense of responsibility towards cultivating that wisdom in terms of our relationship to information, which of course, when I say information, I don't just mean externalized data, but also the information that we're generating within ourselves, our instincts, our thoughts. How do we cultivate wisdom or better relationship with that data as well, not just deploying externalized content in order to make decisions? And as an organization that makes decision-making models for groups, we know very well that some people do not like to stick to those decision-making models. And that's okay, but it's just we're currently in this process of, can we create better tools and be in relationship with those tools to improve just a little bit the kinds of decisions that we're making? But there's 3 hands up. I have no idea who was first.
If I may just add too, I think it's important to remember that values are the basis of any good society, and those are great mottos to throw around. Or value-driven systems is a great motto to throw around. But as we know that, these kind of intentions often get weaponized in ways where we have virtue signaling instead of true virtue, and other such things. So how do we actually remain earnest in the process? And that's something that's extremely hard, and I think that's what we're really also focused on, are sort of not just the technical issues, but also the behavioral behavioral problems. So I think, thinking about values, most people, I would, in my humble estimation, I think most people have many overlapping values. The problem is that we prioritize them differently. And so when we are pressed into a situation where there's some sort of external stress, we change our ranking in terms of what we prioritize in our value systems. So we may, prioritize a person more, or lying more, or stealing, or having a sense of integrity. But we all agree that good thing. Generally, most of us agree that in the good and bad in generalized cases. But in context, those priorities change. So I think when we talk about values, we also have to understand what those values are tied to, which particular context they're tied to. And that becomes very difficult, because then when we talk about climate change or economics or the pandemic, the priority shifts, and that's where the debate becomes tenuous.
Speaking of debate, so it was really interesting, the evolution. I know the hands are waiting, but the evolution of this conversation was really interesting, because I focused on procedure. How do we procedurally remove bias from the sense-making process? And I talked about how the Society Library is working on this institutionally. And then you said, but there's this wisdom and values too. And I said, yes, but we have the wisdom and values. And you're like, but there's got to be something more. So let's talk about that something more. Let's talk about, how do you remove bias in the process of sense making? How does the Consilience project do it when you're writing your situational analyses, when you're doing your meta news? How do you not just throw around the idea that we're being super virtuous and intellectually humble and earnest? How is that actually implemented? How is that induced at the Consilience project?
It's an important question, and I think it's an imperfect answer, but we have tried to build in. Try to build things into the system where, first of all, we have no bylines. We all kind of collectively, it's an extremely decentralized process, and we all contribute in meetings, editorial meetings, where we share our ideas. A piece gets rewritten and re-edited at different stages by different people. There are a number of people that have extremely different backgrounds, and so we ensure that we we try to make this as a collective process, and without any by trying to remove the human incentives also, or the perverse incentives from the process. So at this stage, it is a group of people who debate and argue, not argue necessarily, but exchange ideas. The piece gets rewritten by several different people at different times, and or gets edited at least. You have a piece that has a primary author, and then afterwards it gets edited by the group, and there are different publishing protocols that we have, that we follow. We try to not take, we want to examine important issues, but we try not to take ideological standpoints. We try to really look at alternative viewpoints as well. And most of it is just based on, full scale, trying to really analyze and synthesize to the best of our ability with, with the resources that we have within the group. It would be great if we could scale it, and so that's what we're trying to figure out. I think, how do we actually do this where it's something that can be, transmitted to larger groups? What we do think is scalable is, the body of work that we have that informs people, based on the theory pieces and the meta news. And so, education is, the educational aspect, I think, is the process that's probably really scalable. But in terms of our specific protocol, there's no really reducible methodology at this moment, other than the fact that, we really try to remove the incentives that, would support particular ideologies or any kind of other, explicit perverse incentive, by the collective role of editing and sharing these pieces without bylines.
Cool. And I just want to say, the Consilience project has undoubtedly memed so many fantastic insights about this space. And so I think a lot of people in this whole sense making space are really grateful for the new lens that you've provided. Now, the Society Library has, I think, at least 22 different strategies at 7 stages of our analysis process that I could talk about, but there's a whole bunch of hands up and I don't want to ignore them. So let's talk about hands, and I can talk about these strategies all day long. So I don't know who had their hand up first, but let's, time and check in with everyone else. Hey, everyone, who wants to go first?
With Lynn, she was supposed.
Lynn.
Hi. I don't know if this exactly fits into your presentation, but I've been involved with a Working Partnerships USA, and we're working in conjunction with the Santa Clara County Health Department. It's kind of a boots on the ground kind of organization, and we're reaching out to businesses and residents in Santa Clara County, which is a pretty diverse county in the US in terms of, we go everywhere from Stanford down to Gilroy, which is a very rural area of Santa Clara County. And in the process of this, we're offering free vaccine appointments to help people who don't have access to technology. So we're making appointments for them. There's a number of county sites that can take a large number of people to get vaccinations. And we've been given a lot of interesting, the health department has provided us with very good information in terms of, the myths and truths of vaccination and everything. But yet, I'm still astounded that very intelligent looking, people that have jobs, that are working, will just look me in the face and say, I understand, but this just isn't for me. And I said, what part don't you understand, or what part don't you, why isn't it for you? And they really can't give me an answer as to why it isn't for them. But, they're just resistant to this idea of being vaccinated.
It is really interesting because you can give so many different rational reasons for vaccination that have, little to do, I would say that whether or not, you think that whether or not you think that the vaccine will completely cover you, or, provide real protection, or if you're, in your 20s and you feel like it doesn't provide a big risk, we do know that you know, the approved vaccines that are being used in the United States and most of Europe actually do stop transmission. And that is the most important thing for from societal perspective, which is, what I had written in that article, which is not whether or not, it's not a question of how effective the vaccine is. It doesn't have to be 100% effective. It's just whether or not we can actually suppress the virus enough so that it, so control the transmission so that it doesn't continue to mutate. And of course, then, people love to debate about other topics that are both, again, what we were talking about as a fact earlier, true but not representative. They mention true points, but it doesn't. But it's irrelevant to the particular argument. And a lot of false equivalencies are used as well. People say that you can use a number of different antivirals for protection, but most of those antivirals you have to use at inception. They're not effective once you actually have full-blown COVID. Some of them have to be administered intravenously in the hospital. Some of them are much more dangerous than the vaccines are. And then others say you can just prophylactically dose with a bunch of vitamins, which may not be true, but there's not strong empirical evidence for most of those things. And how those studies are conducted are very, you can't control for human nutrition, and a lot of these epidemiological studies are not normalized against each other. So and even if you were to take a strong case study of something, you would still, taking a vitamin isn't going to stop viral transmission. So you're still harboring the virus and, potentially, and allowing it to, live inside of you and learn your immune system. So I agree with you. I think that there's some sort of fundamental bias within humans where they're reluctant to do something that's for the greater good of people and happier to do something for themselves individually, maybe, because people are willing to take risks with, drugs that have not been approved by government agencies, or even really been reliably tested, and state that I'd rather just take this unknown therapy because it seems to be, I don't know, it's touted by a small group of, people who've looked at it experimentally, rather than look at, big data and tests that may be imperfect, as all experiments are imperfect, but maybe are more robust than the ones that they're looking at. So it's, I think it's some kind of human bias often that's creating that barrier. And it probably has to do with something about, if I'm doing something for myself, then maybe it's got a better outcome than doing something for the group. I'm not really sure. That's just my own theory.
Well, let me jump in really quick, because this is exactly the kind of sense making that the Society Library does. So Rachel, when you said multiple times, like, I don't know, why won't they take this vaccine? Why is there hesitancy? The precise work of the Society Library is to collect all of the different informational assets through which people express their arguments, claims, and evidence, and their positions in relation to certain questions or issues, and be able to articulate all of those things. And when I was talking earlier about like why we care so much about the perception of the information we're putting forth, it's because, Lynn, not only, potentially Rachel's hypothesis about people being a little bit more self-centered in their thinking, and therefore they're not thinking about the greater good. There are plenty of other arguments that people have expressed why they're hesitant about the vaccines. It could be that they've had an extremely long traumatizing experience within medical healthcare scenarios in which their immune system was fundamentally misunderstood. They were prescribed all of these medications, surgeries, and treatments, and they were essentially, they feel abused by the medical system. And then they found that going on a interesting like vegan diet from reading a blog or something actually helped heal them. So there's many different reasons, not only why that motivate people to arrive at the arguments and reasoning to support their point of view. And it's not just experiences that can be articulated and captured in language, but it's also what pieces of evidence are they gathering in order to inform that opinion. And the work of the Society Library is exactly to discover those things. And we do that not just by pulling in the academic content, but TV clips and podcast clips and what people are saying on social media. And we have a partner who helps us bridge that digital divide. And so they host focus groups where they ask people these questions. And the point of our work is, how can we collectively pull together this democracy of ideas so we can at least see where everybody's at? And that's
so I completely agree. And I agree on the fact that, we don't need to that when we're assessing a difficult or complex problem, we need to look at it from many different perspectives, and the science isn't always right. And what I just expressed right now was a personal opinion. It was certainly not a professional opinion, but in response to what Lynn had said. But we also, look at unpopular ideas or ideas that may seem like that others deem as conspiracy theory. I write about this in a piece that I wrote as well about, looking at Carl Sagan's, what's the EECRE, or the extreme, incredible, can someone interrupt me and tell me what it is? Incredible ideas, incredible claims require
extraordinary evidence.
Extraordinary evidence, that's it, right? Sorry. And I think, there are many cases in, history where unpopular ideas, were actually, later found out to be base reality, including, those that seemed incredibly improbable. So, it is important to be curious and to challenge things, and to look at the many different forms of ways in which, not just the empirical evidence, but as you just said, there are explanations that are behavioral or emotional or psychological that are just as valid. If you don't feel comfortable doing something, I don't believe that someone should do something they don't feel comfortable doing. So again, sometimes these are just personal reasons. And when people give me a personal explanation, or they say this is my personal feeling, I also think that that personal decision may be informed on the basis of logic, but it may not. And I don't think that as a society, we are simply rational creatures that should be governed by, the right choices that an algorithm told us or that empirical evidence tells us. I do believe that, we have to do things that are sometimes, we choose to do things often, and I think it's okay, that are on the basis of what we feel. And, as human beings, we should, as a society, we should be entitled to say, I don't feel like doing this. As long as it's not harming other people, without necessarily having to, provide a complex explanation. Because I do think it's important to test these things, yet at the same time, so many of these things are untestable. So we get into these complex debates where they become later on, fractious and ad hominem, because we have a particular preference, but we're not allowed to have that preference. We have to shade that preference with rationality. And I think that's also something that should be considered, which is, as a society, we have values, as you said, and sometimes our values should be, we shouldn't have to invent rational explanations for whatever our feelings or our values are. So I think part of the issue also is, not trying to reverse engineer a rational, some kind of confirmation bias, because, I don't know, I don't want to go swimming because I don't like the water, for example, but I have to give you a long explanation as to why I can't go swimming or something like that.
Right.
So I agree with you that I think it's important. I was just going to summarize that because that was very long-winded.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to say, so of course it's important to do what the Society Library does, which is to, examine all the different alternative narratives, but also to understand, my point added to that, which is to also understand that sometimes the analysis is extremely biased or unknowable or untestable. And so I think sometimes we just need to end the conversation with the agreement that we should be we should give people the freedom to make their own choices based on what it is that they think and feel, without having to impose, interrogation as to, some sort of not interrogation, but where they feel they have to rationalize something with a reverse engineered, logic or some sort of, bias that they have to satisfy why it is that they feel that way. I mean, perhaps one might question why they feel that way and help them come to a better conclusion. But I also think that sometimes, having a little bit more tolerance in our society to let people come to their own, to let people have their own, I think one of the reasons why debate is stymied is because we're focused on having rational conversations so much that we can't have emotional opinions about things often as well. Sorry.
All good. One thing I just want to jump in and say, thank you, Rachel, but also Lynn, one of the things that I like to assume about people is that when they're providing a position on something, even if it's as shallow as, no, I don't want to do this. Yes, I do want to do this. I assume that they've probably had some sort of experience where it's either personal or they've interacted with information that has informed that opinion. And like the thing about human beings is that we don't have perfect memories. The majority of us do not have perfect memories. So we go through life and we interact with all these different forms of media. We watch a video, we have a conversation, and we're left with just like this imprint of an impression that we got from interacting with that information. And we can't perfectly retrieve all of that content and knowledge that we've interacted with that has led us to this particular position. So the first thing I do is I assume that people have reasons for why they believe what they want to believe. But at the same time, I know that our memories are not perfect. We're not databases, but the whole work of the Society Library and how we hope to be serviceable. And this is when I talked about our dialogue projects. Essentially, we're working on simulating societal scale conversation, which means how can we steelman every single point of view and account for all of the different points of view that are engaging in a conversation, so that when you encounter someone and they're like, I don't want to get a vaccine, you can have a place to go, an app on your phone. Well, what are all the categories of reasons why people don't? Some of those will be logic based, some of those will be evidence based, some of those are going to be anecdotal, emotional experiences that people have. And like, that's just what we have to reckon with as a society. But some of the work that we're doing at the Society Library is just to try and help us all get on the same page, because each individual actor, each one of us in society is not wholly prepared to have these incredibly complex conversations, and that may lead to frustration and disagreement and polarization. And so how can we use technology to facilitate communication at the societal scale? Like, social media has enabled us as an entire nation to communicate, but it's not constructive. So the work that we're doing at the Society Library is how do we take in all this data and all the different forms of expression, not just text-based, logical, rational stuff, but like the videos that people are creating, the sarcastic memes, the podcast clips, like the Clubhouse clips potentially. How do we take all of those different expressions of sentiment and organize them into a conversation? And I mean, I really wanted to get deep into sense making, because how we actually organize that conversation is a huge point of importance for the Society Library, because the very specific questions that you ask orient how the conversation goes. And we've created a technique to essentially suss out what are the fundamental questions that a society has. So when I mentioned like the 569 different COVID-19 subjects, for example, if I'm remembering correctly, there's 15 questions that orient that conversation. And what's really important about picking the right questions is that the questions determine what is relevant to discuss. And so we have this specific technique. So instead of just randomly choosing what questions we want to answer about COVID-19, even though of course you can ask infinite questions, it's about finding what are the questions that fully encompass the reason why people are disagreeing in the first place. And I'd love to talk more about that, but I know there's more hands up and I want to get to them too. So Lynn, I don't know if you want to say anything else, but thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to exploring these links. I also wanted to ask, the county has also provided incentives, $50 for people to get their second shot, complete their complete series, and concert tickets, a chance to win concert tickets. Are these likely to help? Certainly it'll help a certain segment of the population, but can it backfire to kind of create some suspicion that they're offering things that are, beside the, to lure people in, I guess is my point. But
my knee-jerk reaction to that, my guess, right? I'm not referencing any evidence. I'm not referencing any sentiments that have been expressed in media on this thing exactly. But my guess would be yes, with certain populations and certain mentalities and orientations, this could backfire, even though in some populations, this would be an incentive. I imagine maybe some younger people would be interested in concert tickets. Perhaps other people would find it suspicious that all of these institutions are willing to pull out various different stops in order to encourage people to get vaccines. But that's just a guess.
I saw something interesting in the chat. Someone said something about everyone has reasons, but then it disappeared. I think that was Hoffman was the name.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, hi, thank you. And enjoying the dialogue here. My observation is it's just an incredibly high level, super intellectual discussion. At some point, it seems to me that to actually engage in dialogue with a QAnon conspiracy nut, for instance, the distinctions between the level that this communication is taking place in this meeting and what needs to happen is quite of a gap. And I'm trying to close that in a very personal manner. I got a cousin who's my closest brother, or was. I was just in process of writing this on the chat, but basically he's not gotten his shots, can't quite articulate why, because doesn't think it's a good idea. And I don't know if whether engaging him is helpful or will further get us further estranged. So I was hoping that some level of dialogue would help me become a better, more effective communicator in that mode. Edith, the question.
Yeah, Rudy, I think it's wonderful that you're looking to engage. And the only thing, well, I have a few things to say, actually. One of the things I would say is that just try to potentially change the way that you're approaching the situation. So if you're approaching the situation with trying to change the behavior or mind of another person, on some level, subconsciously, they may sense that and be resistant towards that. A technique that I use personally, and when we've talked about intellectual humility here on this chat, and this is like a concrete way of actually embodying intellectual humility and putting it to task. One of the things that I like to do when I'm encountering a group of people or an individual who has been saying things that occur to me as potentially outlandish and likely to be incorrect, is I just go spend some time seeing if they're correct and try to prove them right. And I usually find that there's a reason why they have that point of view that they do. There is actually some piece of evidence, some set of arguments that are valid. There is actually something there. It may not be the exact same thing. It may be like an abstract representation of the idea that they have, but I essentially give them a gift. I give them an intellectual gift. So for example, there was someone who I went to high school with on Facebook. They were going on and on about Planned Parenthood, XYZ, something's wrong with them. And so I went through some archives and I looked up that the founder of Planned Parenthood once wrote this letter about, abortion essentially being used as a eugenics project. And I said, okay, here, let me give you this intellectual gift. Here is a hard piece of evidence that supports your point of view. I've demonstrated to you that I care about your point of view. I'm willing to listen to your point of view. I understand that you're very upset about this institution, and it's come from a very real place. And then immediately after that, I got invited to his, obscure podcast. And from there, what we did is we developed trust. So when he knew that I was approaching it with, I respect you, I have found something, a part of your point of view that's valid, here it is. I've not only demonstrated respect, but I've given you a little piece of, an intellectual weapon in your narrative war. And then we could actually talk. Then I could start gently pushing back on some of his ideas. And again, I didn't necessarily want to change his mind. I just didn't believe him. And I wanted to demand that he provide evidence. But before we could engage in that kind of more sincere, rigorous debate, he had to know that I did respect his point of view. And I did that by giving him that little evidence present. So I would recommend the same. Just try and imagine, how could that be true? With QAnon, it's kind of easy. Jeffrey Epstein case is that's whenever I'm talking to someone who I suspect believes in the QAnon, I just take that. Yes, I get it. You're worried about cabal of pedophiles. Well, look at this particular case. Let's talk about that. And then let's talk about some other things. And it seems to work out well. And it's interesting, right? Because it's not in the realm of reason and evidence and all of that. You have to develop trust and respect first. And that's really easy to do if you really care about people.
That's so well said, Jamie. Thank you for saying that. I think that's probably one of the most important points to be made, which is, arguments are rarely binary debates. They're nuanced. As you said, there are lots of reasons that support someone's preferences. Some of them probably unknown to themselves. So the most important thing is to develop trust and respect, but a sincere sense, not just sort of pandering to someone, as they can probably smell that. And so being able to discuss something, that's such a good approach, which is being able to recognize and validate someone's thoughts and feelings without categorically shutting them down. And I think that's the main thing, which is the problem with a lot of debates is that we're very categorical about things and people don't want to be judged. And there may be some sliver of something that makes sense that can help you meet in the middle somewhere. So I really appreciate it. You said that so well, Jamie.
Thank you. And then Andrew, do you want to, or Aditya, you both have had your hands up also for a long time. So maybe we could segue.
Andrew's ahead of me now.
Well, I think we got there. That was a really interesting example. I mean, I think I had two questions. One is that it seems like the primary user of, or at least the scale of intervention here for both the projects are at the level of the individual. And so like as a person is trying to make up their own mind about something or form a view or interact with others to form a view, you see the outputs of what you're trying to do as having tools which help do that. And so maybe the sort of cataloging of different positions helps you approach another who has a different point of view. So I think that's just sort of one question. Want to make sure that that's really, I've got that understanding. And then I guess the second really is at a different scale, which is, and Jamie, you mentioned this a little bit in terms of products around dialogue, but I'm thinking on a societal level. I suppose, at least my view on this is that pluralism is really about irreconcilable values, actually, and tolerance of irreconcilable values. And so, and that often arises because of different life experiences. And so like sort of true compatibility, I guess, or like uniformity of views is actually not possible, nor is it desirable. And the example that I often think about, because I run a foundation and deal with a board, is that the board members have different roles than management has. Like fundamentally, they have different roles, and they're in fact, in some ways, antagonistic by design. You can tell I have a board meeting next week. And so, but I think that's a good thing, because the result of that is a series of checks and balances. And fiduciaries, have a certain point of view in a corporate sense. So I'm just sort of wondering at like what level do we want, should the design of systems need to include antagonism as opposed to just simple consensus? Thanks.
Yeah, wonderful. So I have a few things I want to say, Andrew. So one is that while the Society Library is producing educational products to appeal to like individual sense making and improve that, and also create the library itself, which is accessible to the general public on an individual level. That's a tough uphill battle, I would say. I think that as generations inherit different educational tools, and that's really what we've been angled towards. We're looking to build the library that future generations will grow up with, and looking to build the educational curriculum or a piece of it to contribute to the educational curriculum that future generations will grow up with as something more ubiquitous, because that's probably really difficult to enact right now as we're alive. But one of the things I want to say is that the Society Library's impact, we're looking to have that more at a group level. We've already worked, one, at the local government level. We've created decision-making models at the city council level. Two, we've also been involved in writing legislation. So we've been contracted to improve the sense-making around how do we construct legislation about an X-risk factor. So we're trying to make many different contributions to improving decision-making at various levels. And we have a specific interest in government because that's one of the most impactful impactful levers of power that has a great impact on individuals. So we're not looking to be a think tank or anything, but ultimately the work that we're doing now, and I don't know if I've described this enough, but essentially we've got this project that we're working on now called the Great American Debate. So talk about antagonism. We focus on the most high impact, persistent, and polarizing issues in the United States. And we're deconstructing all of this media that's created about it so that we can model what that debate about currently climate change, even though probably most recently, the most polarizing issue has changed, just probably something around election integrity or just Trump as a topic in general. But when we started the project, it was climate change. And so we're actually modeling what are all of these arguments and showing what are the pro-con arguments. And it's not just, evidence-based logical reasoning, but also the value statements. I mean, you're absolutely right. There are some irreconcilable value conflicts. And all the work that we're doing with this Great American Debate is just to understand how we can collect this data, deconstruct this data, mesh this data together, and model this data as a societal scale deliberation so that we can create the next project, which we call the Internet Government. I'm told it's a terrible name, and we'll deal with that when it comes. But essentially, we want to create a public policy producing engine that optimizes not for determining what value is going to essentially win in a cultural conflict, but can we, by virtue of how we are framing the creation of policy, find some solution to a proposed problem without causing a value domination? So an example that I use for this, and we're a long ways away, we're still working on how do we model, essentially create a Congress of ideas technology. But one of the examples that I give is, when we think about abortion, there's plenty of facts about this issue, from either side, but we also have to deal with the value conflict of some women just do not want the state to ever decide what they can do with what they determine to be their body, while another group believes that thing in your body is not a part of you, it's its own thing and it's its own soul. And so this is just like an irreconcilable value conflict. But if we reframe the problem as we want to lessen abortions, or abortions occurring is a problem, and we find that a viable solution is just increasing education, like sexual education of women of a certain age in certain regions, then we can lessen the existence of the problem without legislation determining what value is going to be protected constitutionally. And so I believe that contention, you can't necessarily always synthesize complete consensus from that, but maybe there's ways in taking account of the different points of view, we can start reframing things so that we can solve what is identified to be problematic without determining what values are more virtuous or ethical.
Andrew, I have a comment on what you just said too, which is, I've often thought about what are the virtues of society that have evolved recently, because most of our democratic ideals evolved thousands of years ago, and we just sort of society keeps cycling through the same problems over and over again with and we rename them contemporaneously. But one thing that is relatively new, a value that is new to the 20th century is that of diversity. And when we think of diversity, we often think of it, in the sense of, doing someone a favor or looking at the, underprivileged. But, analogous to biology, diversity, in an ecosystem, diversity is essential because it's what creates the, as you said, checks and balances in the system. And I think that, in our societal groups, we often promote the idea of, cultural diversity or neural diversity, but we like to define that in a particular way. And we don't really make space for true outliers or make room to hear diverse thoughts. Things get meme propagated in a particular way, and we come up with an idea of what is the popular idea or what sounds like the right idea. And often so many great contributions to society get overlooked because they aren't expressed appropriately. In fact, sometimes the most intelligent person may be the shyest person, or sometimes the best idea may not be the most intelligent idea, but it may be an incredibly creative solution to a problem that we couldn't have predicted. And because society evolves, and it's, society is a living dynamic process, we don't know what tomorrow's problems may be. Climate change is not a fixed problem, it's a relative problem based on, how our societies are constructed today. And so we may find a bunch of people, years ago, I would just say, like, for example, years ago, Obama had suggested that, everyone learn how to code. And I would disagree with that. I would say, having a society full of coders would be very limited and restrictive, because there are so many different, there might be other problems that exist in a future where we have no need for that kind of technology. Maybe we have need for something that we couldn't have even possibly imagined. And so I don't know, I agree with you, Andrew. Being able to promote, I see it as a problem of diversity, but whatever the checks and balances are, finding ways of keeping organic checks and balances rather than these sort of, I don't know, modeled systems that we think we understand and that create blinders and blind spots for the things we can't see. Did someone was coming in? Michael Vassar?
Yeah, I just showed up.
Hey, welcome.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
Cool. So, yeah, I'm very interested in seeing what things people are thinking about epistemics after COVID. It's been, it should have opened a lot of eyes on all sorts of things, and we need to figure out how to move forward through sensible assumptions.
I feel like we've ignored Aditya. How do you say your name?
Yeah, Aditya, hi. Nice to meet you. Great presentation. I wanted to thank Lynn Sobchak especially for going out and trying to engage with people and get them to get vaccines. That's really great grassroots work there. Maybe I should be doing some of that too. I had a question for our panelists, which was, what do you guys think about, instead of paying somebody to take a vaccine, you pay them to like $10 or something to play like a text-based game, like a question and answer game? That might somehow shift their perspective because it's interactive and it can hit upon all these different topics like in succession. What do you guys think about the efficacy of something like that? Like, do people's minds change more often when they engage with the information, like in a video game or in a call and response format, more than when it's just given to them in text or pictures? I don't know.
I'll throw a question out there before answering that, and maybe Jamie can answer this too. I think the question even that precedes that is, do you believe in nudges, and do you think nudges are ethical? And that's just to be provocative. I'm not saying I do or I don't.
Yeah, I mean, sure. The government's paying you to go see a concert, so that's a pretty big nudge, right? There's $1 million lottery. So I think the government at least has taken the perspective that getting shots in people's arms is a good thing, and they're willing to do a lot of things to make that happen financially. So I'm just assuming that perspective already, although that's a great question as well.
And related to your question, Rachel, is that you may be interested to know, the Society Library isn't interested in changing what people think. We're just interested in changing the context in which people think. And we're optimizing for increased comprehension of the various points of view. So we're exploring a variety of different ways in which we can present information and to what extent information can be engaged with. But our goals are to increase subject matter comprehension, not necessarily to nudge people in a particular direction or outcome.
Oh yeah, I wasn't implying that. Sorry, I wasn't implying that.
I know. No, I was agreeing with you. I was just saying.
And I do think we have very similar values in terms of not trying to influence people's decisions, but to clarify their sense making. Yeah.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm curious. Have you heard when you were describing diversity and how it's important, because we never know what future problems there will be. So having a diverse set of perspectives, individuals, skills is necessary in order for us to remain adaptable to circumstance. I was wondering, have you heard of Alan Watts discussing this, a story of him being invited by a team of geneticists about, yes, you have? Okay, I was wondering, it sounded so familiar. So I was like, I think I've heard this argument before. Great, I'm glad we had the same source.
Yeah, I also wrote a piece a long time ago, about 10 years ago, called The Luxury Bunker. And it was when I think it just sort of, the rise of populism was, sort of being acknowledged. And instead of circulating, instead of coming together in some sort of useful way, people were just sort of opting out and building their own luxury bunkers in Costa Rica or in Hawaii and other places. People were basically building silos. So because people lost faith. Anyway, it was anecdotal, but it was this idea that many people were choosing to live in, their own created collective societies rather than trusting in the greater society and siloing off more. And I was saying that there are so many advantages to living in these organizations and groups, and I could see benefits to them as well. But at the same time, it's also important to, be around a range of different people, including those you may not think you initially like or are like for many reasons, because there's many surprises that people can share. And so that was based on this topic about people living in these luxury bunkers.
Yeah, just back to my question, even if there's no point to the game, do people actually engage with the information and change their critical thinking behaviors when they engage with, let's say, all points of view in an interactive way, as opposed to an interactive and directed way, right? Like we make you go through all the points of view, right? Would that change their perception more than something else?
I don't know the answer to your question, Aditya, but there is some professors at a university that's working on setting up a RCT study to see if how we present information, which is in our current software to a certain degree interactable and has various levels of engagement. Does it prime a subsequent facilitated conversation? Does it prime people to be more open-minded, have less aggressive attitudes, and bring up more points when they're having a facilitated deliberation or discussion about a polarized issue? So we're going to see if it makes a difference in terms of how sticky information is and what is the impression that people take away from viewing multiple threads and points of view in a visualized way, as opposed to like reading blocks of text or reading Wikipedia articles that also summarize various points of view. So we don't know, but we hope to find out.
I think it depends on how the experiment is conducted and framed as well. I mean, I've heard of instances where, when people are asked to reframe the debate, something controversial, like the Israeli-Palestine conflict, for example, telling them or giving them a particular perspective is not always the same as actually making them reframe it where they take the empathetic position of, whatever the opposition is.
Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, we're just seeing, is the way that we structure the information currently, does it have an impact? Or do we have to induce some kind of, framing techniques or something like that? So, I mean, the work that we're doing, and I really hope that there's going to be this just explosion, that there's already various fields like human and computer interaction and things like that. But I hope there's just this creative explosion of how people are going to be arranging knowledge and information, not only educationally, but for dialogue and deliberation. And we're just going to start incrementally exploring what is most effective at achieving the outcomes that you and I share, Rachel, which is not necessarily to coerce or persuade, but just to open up people's understanding of complexity and enabling them to see from various points of view and inducing intellectual humility and all of these different values that we share in our project. So I'm really hoping for that. And I'm hoping that we can participate in that and then also benefit from it, because I think the Consilience project, I believe you all are a short-term project. Is that right? You're looking to kind of catalyze a cultural enlightenment around sense making.
Sure. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, that's a good point. That's also part of our incentive structure, which is we all come from various backgrounds with different, areas of expertise and interests, and even very different ideologies. And so there is a hard stop time limit on the project, which is 5 years. So, just one of the ways in which we're sort of trying to demonstrate that we can get this done within a time limit. This is not an ongoing project where, we're, looking to raise money for an unknown period of time, that we're very specific with our goals and our milestones, and that no one's looking to profit from this project.
And the Society Library is very distinct from that. We are hoping that we will be an institution that is serviceable and useful to society for a very long time.